Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. Today, we want to discuss the fall of Syria from the perspective of what may come next and how Armenia should navigate it.
And our guest today is Dr. Arman Grigoryan, who is an associate professor of international relations at Lehigh University, specializing in international security, nationalism, and post-Soviet politics. We look forward to an exciting and interesting discussion, so please stay tuned.
Yes, absolutely. But before we start, Hovik, I wanted to greet our over 3,500 new listeners. Welcome to our channel, folks. We appreciate your presence and your interest. We hope to keep bringing to you these interesting discussions and reviews of Armenian news. Now, we read all of your comments under our videos, and we think you're making a difference in the visibility of our shows and our channel. So keep sharing your thoughts, like our shows, share our shows with your friends and circles. Okay, on with our show. Hello, Dr. Grigoryan. Welcome back on Groong.
Hello, Dr. Grigoryan.
Hello, Hovik. Hello, Asbed. Glad to be back.
Absolutely great to have you. So earlier this month, the West, through Turkish-backed terrorist groups, finally toppled Bashar al-Assad in Syria. An internationally wanted terrorist and his internationally recognized terrorist organization are now forming the next government of Syria. For years, Erdogan has been unsuccessful in getting Assad to negotiate a deal. This time, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said that they were able to convince Russia and Iran not to support Assad. So how would you summarize what's happened in Syria over the past month? And also, I'm very curious to know, what has Erdogan been asking Assad that Assad has not been agreeing to for many years?
Okay, so it is interesting. The Fidan's statement is quite interesting, and there is some other information that Turks have been trying for the last few months to offer some kind of a deal to Assad, but Assad has been intransigent, and that's one of the reasons why Russia and Iran, or at least Russia, withdrew its support from Assad. I don't know. I haven't seen any confirmation of that statement from other sources, from Russian sources, but be it as it may, I think despite the Turkish statement about Assad's behavior, I think it was clear that there was a coalition that formed with the explicit aim of toppling the Assad government. The coalition consisted of Turkey, the USA, Israel, and Al-Qaeda. And it was not just the Turkish intentions in Syria that mattered and Turkey's conflicts with Syria that mattered, but also the conflicts of these three other actors that combined with that of Turkey, and that resulted in the creation of this coalition and the decision to go after Assad hard. I think if we were to summarize that event and what happened and what its significance is, it certainly dealt a serious blow to Iran's strategy in the Middle East of slowly strangling Israel by creating these, I don't even remember what they call it, but the kind of belt of Shiite forces around Israel.
Axis of resistance?
Axis of resistance, yeah. Which included Syria, certainly. It included Hezbollah, it included the Houthis, and Syria was a very important actor in that axis, as Syria was Iran was able to supply and gain access to Hezbollah and Lebanon through Syria. So taking out Syria changes the strategic picture quite dramatically. It was also a serious setback for Russia. I mean, there is no doubt about that. It undermined the Russian influence in the region. Assad was a Russian ally. Russia lost an ally in the Middle East, and its military presence there now is under a serious question mark, even though Putin made some statements that he has no problem reaching an understanding with the new Syrian government. But there is no question that this event has changed quite significantly the balance of power in the region and the strategic picture in the region in favor of Turkey, Israel, and the United States, and against Russia and Iran. Now, I should insert some caveat here. However, thinking of the regime change in Syria as the end of the problem, end of the story, is probably wrong. I think even if they have solved some problems in Syria, they're going to have to deal with a bunch of new ones. Their interests certainly coincided over a number of matters, a number of issues, but it is no secret that they have also conflicting interests there. And also, we have the already rich history of the type of the type of political forces that now has taken over Syria, taking over other countries, and it usually doesn't end well. So it remains to be seen what the gains of Turkey, Israel, and the United States are going to look like in the midterm to the long-term future in Syria.
As you mentioned, Turkey is a key player in all of this, but is Turkey's policy in Syria rational in the first place? And will Turkey be able to control the hodgepodge of radical militant groups that are now dispersed all over Syria? Aren't we looking at a new Afghanistan?
It's quite possible, as I said in my answer to the previous question, in the end of my answer to the previous question. These sort of regimes do not produce a stable, well-governed countries, and usually you do get things like Afghanistan, like the Iraqi insurgency, like what you got in Libya. So at least the experience up to this point suggests that we may see something similar to that, even though it seems like they have worked quite well and for some time with Jolani and his crowd, and they are making all the right noises, and their rhetoric is different, they look different, and they are making certain conciliatory statements. But let's not delude ourselves. I mean, Syria is a very complicated country. It has a lot of cleavages, a lot of serious conflicts along ethno-confessional lines, and governing a place like that is a very, very difficult proposition. And governing it, in some kind of a democratic setting, it's hard to predict such a future for a kind of political force that has now taken over in Syria. As far as the rationality of Turkey's policy is concerned, it's difficult to give an unequivocal answer to that question. Rationality itself, or judging some policy as rational itself, is a fraught business. But one can, instead of answering the question directly, one can probably look at the costs and benefits of that behavior, or the benefits and risks of the Turkish behavior. So what could Turkey possibly gain? What could Turkey hope to gain by supporting the Syrian rebels? One of the obvious things, one of the obvious benefits for Turkey, or hopes for Turkey, is that this policy will feed into Turkey's aspirations of leadership in the Islamic world. It's not a secret that Erdogan has articulated such aspirations and such ambitions, and certainly taking a leading role in Syria is going to be consistent with such an aspiration. It should be pointed out that, in fact, this is something that has received encouragement from the West as well. Not just, I mean, they can hope to sell this to the West as well, not just to the Islamic world, because in the West they think that if Islamic movements were to model themselves after Turkey, if Turkey can serve as an example of an Islamic country that is also governed democratically, and it has, anyway, certain features of democracy, at least, that's a good thing. And they can hope to have the support of the West in that regard as well. I mean, it's an opportunity to crush the Kurds in Syria, which is one of the obvious benefits for Turkey, given its preferences. It's an opportunity to strengthen the Turkomans in Syria, and possibly even redrawing the map in Turkey's favor, which is something that has, I think, I don't want to be mistaken here, but I think even Erdogan made some statements which could be interpreted in this way. But I may be mistaken about this. Certainly, some others have talked about redrawing the map and claiming some parts of northern Syria in favor of Turkey. Finally, it was an opportunity to curry favor with Israel and the USA. We know the relations with these countries were strained, and this was an opportunity to reduce the tensions. At the same time, there were costs and risks for this policy. Most importantly, I think this has made attacking Iran easier for Israel and the United States. And for quite some time, at least the official Turkish posture has been that they're against such an attack, that they fear such an attack because it can really blow up the region, and they have resisted this idea. It can undermine Turkey's reputation and standing in the very Islamic world where they have these leadership aspirations, because it can be seen as betrayal of the Palestinians, which Turkey has been quite radical in terms of its support for Palestinians, at least at the rhetorical level. Instead of improving relations with Israel and the United States, it can create opportunities for more friction, given the very different preferences with regard to the Kurds. And recently, Lindsey Graham and John Kennedy of Louisiana have made some statements in that regard, some stern warnings and criticisms of Erdogan. I think Lindsey Graham even threatened sanctions against Turkey, and this was related to the Kurds. And finally, it could possibly undermine the relations with Russia, although this is hard to judge how much of it was coordinated with Russia, how much the Russians were aware of it, how much, or whether the Russians are completely resigned to this given their other problems. But at least some analysts, and I think Larry Johnson, who was a guest on the Groong podcast, in one of his statements, argued that this was essentially a betrayal of Russia by Turkey, and this is going to have consequences. I'm not sure about that, but it's not an unreasonable argument to make.
But can I ask you a couple of more questions about that specific point? Because yesterday, the Washington Post was recording that Russia is pulling out its critical air defense systems, other weaponry from Syria. Well, as you said, Russia and Iran have suffered a significant defeat in the Middle East with the toppling of Syria. But how strategic was Syria to Russia? And in a sense, I'm asking also, how could Turkey actually have convinced these guys to let Syria go? Were they promised something on the other end, and what could that have been?
One can only speculate about that.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. It's entirely possible that it was done in coordination, as I already hinted at, rather than, in the form of a betrayal and presenting the Russians with a fait accompli. It's quite possible. Now, certainly the very mild Russian rhetoric and reactions suggest that something like that may have been at work, but also it could be because Russians couldn't do anything else, so they made a virtue out of necessity and simply didn't chose not to escalate or not to create tensions with Turkey. We don't know, but it is entirely possible that this has been done in coordination with Turkey. As far as how much it has undermined Russia's interests in the Middle East and how important Syria was, I think it was important. I think it was very important in terms of increasing Russian influence, and when Russians entered Syria a decade ago during the civil war there. I mean, it was quite a demonstration of Russia's increased capabilities and power and its ability to project power beyond what it had been able to do for quite some time. It was giving Russia serious leverage in Middle Eastern politics, and it was also indirectly important for Russia because it was important for Iran. So in all those respects, I think this was a serious setback for Russia, and I'm not sure I buy Putin's argument or Putin's statement that, well, it's not a big deal. We can deal with the new government, and we have no problem dealing with the new government.
Mhm.
I think it is pretty obvious that they'd rather have Assad stay in power there than, deal with this new government, and especially given, again, what consequences this is likely to have for Iran. Now, having said that, I mean, Syria was important for Russian influence there and for projecting Russian power and increasing Russia's prestige, etc., etc. Was it a matter of existential interest for Russia? Was losing Syria a matter of existential threat to Russia? Can they live without that presence in Syria? I think it's not a matter of an existential threat. Losing Syria, I mean, I guess the best way to describe it, losing Syria is not the same thing as losing Ukraine. So these are two very different propositions. And in fact, I think in the end, given how stretched Russian capabilities are in Ukraine, I mean they're fighting, they're on a roll now. But we shouldn't fool ourselves thinking that it's easy for Russia. It's a very costly, difficult campaign in Ukraine, and Russian capabilities are stretched to the limit. So they had to make a choice, and they essentially had to think about economy of force, and they probably decided that it's not worth fighting on another front or getting into a serious crisis in another area. So while I think it's a setback, I think it's not the end of the world for Russia. I don't think they think of it as an existential threat, but it was a setback.
I want to talk a little bit more about Russia and Iran. They were expected to sign a comprehensive, that's their word, strategic partnership agreement. First, it was expected to be signed at BRICS. I'm not sure if this was a formal announcement or just like some analysts predicting it, but the signing now appears to have been postponed until at least January. I tried to research if there's a specific date, but I've heard there's going to be a big ceremony in Moscow. I'm not sure if that's still the plan. But are you aware of the strategic partnership between Iran and Russia, or what is about to be signed? And will this agreement include any security or defense component? And will the events in Syria reduce the importance of that partnership, or will they push them closer together? So will Russia and Iran be prompted to be closer partners because of this?
So as far as why the agreement has been postponed, I don't know. I do think it will be signed in the end. Who knows what items need to be rethought or renegotiated there. The more important point you're raising is the possibility of explicit security guarantees to Iran, or a defense alliance of some sort. I think Russians will not sign such an alliance. Russians will not make such explicit commitments. Instead, they will give Iran security assistance without necessarily taking up an alliance commitment. And the logic is quite similar to how the United States and Western Europe are behaving toward Ukraine. Yeah, so they know full well that if they were to give an explicit security guarantee to Ukraine, or include Ukraine into NATO, and they would have to invoke Article 5, and that would make a war with Russia, direct confrontation with Russia, inevitable. Given the very tense relationship between Iran and the United States, as well as Israel, Russians have to have the same worry. I mean, if they give an explicit guarantee, are the Russians willing to go to war with the United States to protect Iran? That it's unlikely that the Russians will make such a commitment. But I think Russians have been giving Iran very significant security assistance, especially in recent times. We've seen how effective the Iranian air defense systems are, and that's thanks to the Russians in good part, and they will continue to do so. And as far as the second part of your question is concerned, which is whether the events in Syria have undermined Russia's interest in Iran, Russia's appetite for supporting Iran. I think it's the opposite. I think now that Syria is gone and Iran is more threatened, I think the Russians are going to be even more worried and more concerned about what might happen in Iran, and the loss of Iran is going to be an even more. I mean, that one will be a real strategic catastrophe, and they will probably do everything they can to support Iran, to give Iran security assistance. But again, I don't think it will take the form of an explicit security guarantee.
Yeah, one way to model, I think, Syria is that maybe this was a tactical retreat by Russia, and that it's a temporary move. And I'm just wondering, I guess it's a follow-on to the previous question. Is there a parallel to be drawn between the Russian disengagement in Syria and then also the Russian neutrality and eventual withdrawal from Artsakh or Karabakh, and essentially acceding that to Azerbaijan?
Well, some parallels probably can be drawn. There have been arguments that in Artsakh, Russia assumed a more inert position because of its preoccupation in Ukraine and because it wanted to avoid another crisis. And the same logic. Its capabilities were stretched to the limit in Ukraine, and also that particular crisis, if Russians were to intervene forcefully, could have jeopardized Turkey's very valuable positive neutrality, and they certainly wanted to avoid that. And all of it is related to the fact that they are preoccupied and stretched to the limit in Ukraine. But the parallel probably ends there, because Russia's abandonment of Artsakh was not only a consequence of the limits of its power. I think when we think about the Russian behavior, we cannot ignore the fact that the Armenian government's behavior mightily contributed to that outcome and to the Russian posture. And I'm speaking in particular of the Armenian government's refusal to implement Article 9 of the ceasefire agreement, which was guaranteed by the Russians and which put the Russians in a very difficult position in their dealings with Azerbaijan as well as Turkey. Armenian government recognized Azerbaijan's unconditional sovereignty over Karabakh without, at least according to the Russian sources, they did not coordinate that decision with Russia.
Sorry, for our listeners, I just want to remind them that Article 9 talks about the communication routes, and especially the so-called Zizun Corridor, so opening communication routes between mainland Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan to be guarded by Russian troops.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, continue, please.
So and also again the recognition of Azerbaijan's unconditional sovereignty over Karabakh, which was done in Prague at the prodding of Armenia's Western partners and without coordination with Russia. At least the Armenian government has not denied the Russian statements that it was done without any consultation or coordination with Russia. And we know that Russia had a very different preference with regard to how the Karabakh conflict should be solved. They didn't want the status to be determined in the first phase of normalization. But anyway, the Armenian government went for it. And also there is the general drift toward the West by the Armenian government, while Russia was in a de facto war with the West. That could not have helped the matter. So while there are some parallels having to do with the limitations of Russian power and its preoccupation in Ukraine, which could have contributed to its more inert behavior, I think the parallel ends there. There are significant differences as well.
Okay. And also, what about the Kurds now? The US is supporting the Kurds. Israel is supporting the Kurds. The Turks hate the Kurds. There's an oil field there somewhere that the US has an interest in. Trump says that oil field is ours. We got the oil. And now we're seeing that Turkish-backed SNA, Syrian National Army, is preparing to go on the offensive, and the full Turkish army is amassing on the border, and everyone is saying that before January 20th, there will be a Turkish attack. How do Turkish and U.S. interests jive in Syria, especially in relation to the Kurds?
I think it's obvious that their interests diverge there. Kurds are an important non-state ally of the United States as well as of Israel. In fact, I think I'm on firm ground suggesting that one of the main reasons why the relations between Israel and Turkey soured so badly in after 2008, 2010, around that time, it was because of Israel's support for Kurds in Iraq and in Syria. So this has been one of the most important reasons why the otherwise very close relationship, very close partnership between Turkey and Israel hit some rocks in the last 15 years or so. So that problem has not ended. I think they had put it on the back burner to solve more immediate issues, and they had not. I don't think they have reached an understanding on how to deal with it. At least the statements coming out from Turkey and the United States don't suggest that they have reached an understanding on this issue. And this is going to be a serious problem in their relations. I mean, they have very, very different preferences indeed. And the United States' position has already been undermined a couple of times with regard to the Kurds. And the United States, both domestically and internationally, has been subjected to some criticism for betraying the Kurds. And this time around, it seems like they're firm in their intention, in their intent to not abandon the Kurds. But such intentions have existed before, and policies have changed given expediency and given other problems they've had to solve.
Arman, I'm sorry to interrupt. What is the value of the Kurds to Israel? We know what the problem is for Turkey, but what's the value of this community to Israel and also the United States, I guess?
I think for Israel, it's pretty obvious. It is part of. I think it's consistent with the longstanding Israeli doctrine of finding and befriending entities and states outside of in the Muslim world, outside of the Arab countries. And in particular, if you think about the Kurdish, I mean, where are the Kurdish minorities situated? I mean, there is a Kurdish minority in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, and Turkey. And three of these countries are hostile or were hostile to Israel, and were strong supporters of the Palestinian cause. So alliance with the Kurds against these regimes would be quite important. Although in Syria the relationship between the Kurds and the Assad regime was not quite the same as the relationship of Iraqi Kurds with Saddam. But I think it is consistent with this logic of having friends in the non-Arab Muslim world, and in Syria specifically undermining the Assad regime and would be one of the reasons. Although I did say that the Kurds in Syria were not so hostile to the Assad regime, but again, it was part of this general logic of friendly relations with the Kurds.
All right. Well, let me shift our attention a little bit over to the South Caucasus. With Turkey and Israel currently embroiled in the partitioning and controlling of Syria, Turkey may no longer have the bandwidth at the present time to commit to new military adventures like their Zizun Corridor in Armenia. In fact, Larry Johnson expressed this exact view on our podcast, episode 395, about a week ago. But their proxy, Azerbaijan, of course, continues to arm at an accelerated pace and continues its war rhetoric. How is Syria affecting the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan? Are these developments in Syria presenting Azerbaijan with new opportunities, let's say?
I think the main consequence of the fall of the Assad regime, as far as Azerbaijan's intentions and Azerbaijan's strategies are concerned, is that now Azerbaijanis are going to feel probably more confident that Iran is not going to risk an intervention, and the Iranian influence and the Iranian stance has been weakened by this. Iran now has other things to worry about. And I think it is a real possibility now that Iran will come under attack. I think the tensions between Israel and Iran, between the United States and Iran, are going to escalate after the fall of the Assad regime, and that may be interpreted by the Azerbaijani leadership as a window of opportunity. And I don't think Turkey's preoccupation in Syria and the lack of bandwidth to get involved in the South Caucasus while it's dealing with the problems in Syria is not going to be much of a deterrent, because Turkey's military participation is not so necessary. I mean, military support to Azerbaijan is not so necessary. I think Azerbaijan, unfortunately, probably has the capability to do it without significant Turkish participation. And even if Turkish participation is necessary, I don't think it will take up too much of the Turkish resources and energy to lend support to Azerbaijan. So I think the danger has probably increased after this development. And the other problem which has been around and has not been resolved is that it's not just a matter of Armenia confronting Azerbaijan on this issue. I think this is beyond Armenia and Azerbaijan. This should be understood in a much broader geopolitical conflict. And a few months ago, when the Undersecretary of State O'Brien was in Yerevan, he explicitly stated that Armenia should resist the implementation of Article 9 and possible deployment of Russian troops there as security guarantors. And the communications should be opened, but without any Russian presence and participation. And in fact, the projects that are related to the opening of those communications should also exclude Russia. So thinking of this as simply, Azerbaijan is insisting on the implementation of this of that commitment in the ceasefire agreement in order for it to have access to Nakhichevan is not the right way of thinking about it. I think this is a much broader geopolitical conflict. And given that, I think the danger that something like that might happen with a Russian yellow light is still a possibility, if not more of a possibility.
So how do all these developments affect Iran's red lines around the Turkish so-called Zangezur corridor? Is it still willing to call it a red line, or has it softened up? What do you think?
I think even before, when they argued that when they stated that it was a red line for them, I have on numerous occasions argued that it may be a serious, very important issue for Iran, and Iranians are very much interested in keeping Zangezur under Armenian control and maintaining their border with Armenia. But even despite the seriousness of this interest, the depth of this interest, Iran would not intervene in such a conflict without coordination with Russia, without agreement with Russia. Certainly, it wouldn't do so against the Russian preferences and in confrontation with Russia. Iran has enough problems, and Iran is facing a serious crisis with the United States and Israel, and getting into a conflict or a crisis with Russia over the Zangezur corridor probably would be beyond its capabilities and beyond what would be reasonable for Iran, no matter how important the Zangezur corridor issue is for Iran.
So just a couple of days ago, Aliyev gave an interview where he listed his outstanding demands from Armenia. Briefly, he wants to settle 300,000 Azerbaijanis who he says left Armenia since the late 80s. He wants them back in Armenia. He wants to remove the EU mission in Armenia, which he's calling a NATO operation front, basically. He wants to stop the rearming of the Armenian defense forces. And he wants Armenia to drop all international suits against Azerbaijan and dissolve the OSCE Minsk group. And even after all this, peace will not be assured. And our guests have repeatedly said that Aliyev can arbitrarily come up with new demands, and he has no interest in signing any kind of an agreement, short of a complete destruction of the Armenian state. He doesn't want an Armenian state. Um, did you see Aliyev's interview with Kisilyov, and what were your takeaways from this interview?
So two of those demands were about the outstanding issues in the negotiations for a peace treaty. The one is the withdrawal of claims in international courts mutually, and the other one was the withdrawal of the EU monitoring mission. So these are the two things that they are still negotiating, and that are the two outstanding issues. I think they said that there are 17 articles in the peace treaty, and these two are the ones that they haven't reached an agreement on, which is kind of surprising because I would think that there is more of a conflict and disagreement over the communications issue, which he didn't say anything about.
That was taken out of the peace treaty, right? If we remember,
Yeah.
they agreed to take it out, and some said that, well, it'll be implemented later. But actually, my opinion is that that communication issue, God forbid, it might be actually implemented earlier
Yeah.
by force by Azerbaijan. So
That's very important. I mean, he articulated a number of demands. Only two of them are matters of negotiations with regard to the peace treaty, which means even if those things are agreed upon, the other demands will still be outstanding, will still be there, and they are going to keep making more and more demands. And in fact, these demands probably are designed to make sure that Armenia doesn't agree to sign a peace treaty. These demands are probably designed to sabotage the peace treaty and signal to the Armenians that the peace treaty is not going to mean anything. And the demands are going to continue. I think it's pretty obvious what Aliyev's logic is. I think I've made this parallel on numerous occasions in other fora, in other interviews. One of the things that is quite obvious is that Aliyev has adopted the Versailles model. He wants not just peace, he wants basically a total capitulation of Armenia, imposition of such conditions on Armenia that Armenia would never recover from that state, would never even potentially become a threat to Azerbaijan, and would essentially be a state under Azerbaijani diktat, and will not be able to protect its own interests even. And from some realist or rationalist perspective, one can understand that. I mean, the balance of power and the diplomatic environment favors Azerbaijan, favors such a policy, and they are exploiting it to the hilt. On the other hand, as I have said also on numerous occasions, including to Azerbaijani audiences, this may not be the right strategy because while I don't think Azerbaijan is going to be able to achieve that result. Azerbaijan is not the kind of country that would be allowed to achieve that result. In the long run, I don't think this is a realistic strategy. All it's going to do is undermine any prospect of real reconciliation, normalization, peace, and it's going to have detrimental effects on Armenian internal politics, and it's going to create all sorts of incentives in Armenia for revanchism, etc., etc. Now, there is another reason why Aliyev may not be interested in a peace treaty. I mean, can you imagine what happens in Azerbaijani domestic politics once the problem is resolved with Armenia? And Armenia stops being the justification for all sorts of things.
Everything.
for everything that Azerbaijan is doing, and every time there is an opposition. I mean, by the way, we had this problem in Armenia as well. Every time there was an oppositional movement and criticism of the Armenian governments since 1998, it was the argument was you can't possibly do this and risk destabilizing the country while we have this unresolved thing with Azerbaijan. And now I think the same logic is going to work in Azerbaijan, where a real peace and reconciliation with Armenia is going to refocus the Azerbaijani public's and political elites' attention to Azerbaijan's internal problems, to the failings of the Azerbaijani government, to its extremely undemocratic and corrupt nature, etc., etc. So it is in fact easy to understand why Aliyev is doing this.
Meanwhile, Armenia last week asserted that the so-called, again, air quotes, Zangezur Corridor is a red line for Armenia and cannot be crossed. We haven't heard such a profound rejection of that recently. So why is the Armenian government now being vocal about this? And it seems like almost on everything else, Pashinyan is saying, well, we can negotiate constitution, fine. Even resettling Azerbaijanis doesn't seem to be a red line, but Zangezur Corridor is a red line. What is motivating Armenia to be so bold on this statement?
This is speculation on my part. We don't know. We can't get into Pashinyan's head, or we're not privy to their diplomatic communications. But I think it is precisely related to the geopolitical context. And probably some people are telling Pashinyan stand firm on this, whereas they're not saying with equal conviction to stand firm on the resettlement of Azerbaijanis in Armenia, or the other demands that Aliyev is making on Armenia, which are not particularly important for the interests of those who are telling the Pashinyan government to stand firm on this. Let me actually add a word or two on this. I mean, this red line issue, you draw a red line when you have the capability to defend that red line. You otherwise wouldn't want to get into a conflict, right? You would prefer some kind of a deal, some kind of a peaceful solution, some kind of a compromise, but you draw a red line and say, okay, if we don't come to a compromise, this is it. I'm going to fight beyond this point. Now, if you don't have the capability to defend that red line, I don't really understand what the point of drawing a red line is. Now, maybe Armenia already has the capability. Maybe Armenia has the kind of promises of support and commitments that will allow the Armenian government to defend that red line, in which case it does make sense. As I said, we're not privy to a lot of information, to a lot of communications. But if it's not, and judging from our recent history, sometimes statements are made about aspirations and diplomatic postures and preferences that are not really supported by material capabilities and sufficient diplomatic support. So I wouldn't be surprised if this red line is not as red as Pashinyan thinks after all. But again, I mean, the point is that you draw a red line when you can reasonably defend it. I don't understand the point of drawing red lines when you can't defend it.
So maybe it should have been pink or purple or something like that.
And also, when you say there are some, he's being told to stand his ground. Do you? I mean, I think so. So the West is telling him to stand his ground on that.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was when I referred earlier to O'Brien. I mean, that's where this sort of encouragement is coming from. But again, here is one important point. Sometimes some people in Armenia, including some people in the government, are too eager to interpret certain statements of support as commitments to defend Armenia if certain policies that these statements of support are about um, are to lead to a conflict or to a confrontation. Statements of support are not enough. Statements of support should be, if they don't come parallel with serious commitments and serious guarantees, then these statements of support mean nothing. But the point, the really interesting point is that given their proclivity to a lot of wishful thinking, given the overall general policy they have adopted with regard to reorienting the country toward the West, every tiny bit of statement, every tiny statement that they hear about support and we're with Armenia, we stand by Armenia, etc., kind of there is a temptation to give it more weight than it usually has, and that's very dangerous.
I mean, we keep hearing that India is delivering weapons to Armenia, France is selling weapons. And I think that, as you imply, the only way Armenia can defend its red lines is to be able to do so independently and through military force. So the key to stopping the bleeding, so to say, is to restore the balance of power, with Azerbaijan at least. Do you see any of that happening? And we're seeing, of course, Azerbaijan threatening. Actually, I would be more than happy if Azerbaijan saw a real threat and said, "Oh, hey, you better not get these new weapons." But seeing all these supplies flying from Israel, from Eastern Europe to Azerbaijan on a daily basis almost nowadays, is Armenia seriously rearming itself in order to be able to restore balance of power?
Look, I haven't looked at all the purchases. I don't have a list of things that Armenia has purchased from France and India over the last what is it, a year or two. One thing is pretty clear. I don't think it will be enough to match Azerbaijan's capability, as you pointed out. I mean, Azerbaijan has, what is it? It increased its defense budget to $5 billion.
That's right. To Armenia's increased to 1.7 billion.
Yeah, so it's not a serious proposition that Armenia is going to rearm itself to the point where it will be a threat to Azerbaijan. Perhaps Armenia can acquire a level of capabilities which will be sufficient to impose some costs on Azerbaijan if Azerbaijan were to attack, and that may be some source of anxiety for Aliyev. But even then, I think thinking about this purely in military terms is the wrong way to go about it. I think the problem is strategic and diplomatic. And if Armenia doesn't have an explicit security guarantee, an explicit guarantee from the same France or India or anybody else, I think in the case of a military confrontation, the supply of these weapons is not going to mean much. And if we put this in the context of Armenia's drift away from Russia, and sometimes it already starts resembling a hostile relationship between Russia and the Russia and Armenia, all sorts of threats about leaving the CSTO. If Russia were to remain neutral and no other state were to guarantee Armenia's security against Azerbaijan, I don't think these military purchases are going to make quite the difference that people think they make. One other thing I want to point out in this regard. Everybody and their best friend is in favor of Armenia acquiring capabilities, restoring its military might, and reforming its army, and acquiring the ability to defend itself. Right? Who would be against it? One thing that we have to understand, however, is that if you have a situation where you are weak and you have unsettled problems with an adversary, you have unsettled conflicts with an adversary, and you start getting strong and acquiring new capabilities, and the trajectory is such that at some future date you will be able to do certain things that your adversary really fears. What kind of incentives does that generate for your adversary? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. It generates incentives for preventive action, right? To nip it in the bud before it has become a real threat. So I think my advice to the Armenian government would be you should try to acquire these capabilities, and you should try to acquire the ability of Armenia to defend itself, but the process has to take place in a context, in a diplomatic and strategic context, where somebody will hold Azerbaijan's hand, where somebody will deter Azerbaijan from engaging in preventive action. If that is not done, if you haven't created the necessary diplomatic environment for it, I think rearming would be in fact dangerous. So, but whenever you say this, people are shocked and dismayed. Like, you don't want Armenia to become stronger. No, I do want Armenia to become stronger, but it has to be done. It has to be done with a lot of care and consideration for what consequences that may have, and in what diplomatic environments it's reasonable and safe to do.
Well, we all talk about the CSTO relations, which have become a little bit of a disaster area right now, but Armenia continues to have a bilateral defense relationship with Russia. So there's a little bit of that. Of course, we don't know what Russia will do, if it's going to pretend that the borders are unknown and it doesn't know at what point to intervene or not to intervene. But previously, Arman, you have termed Armenia's pivot to the West as misguided. I think we talked about it in episode 349. You argued that the West is in no position to protect Armenia from Moscow's wrath. Do you think that under the current conditions, Armenia has tried to temper its enthusiasm towards the West and has started to do a little bit more of a balanced relationship between Russia and the West?
In recent times, there were some signs of that happening. But I think the Armenian government's behavior is really tied to the events that happened yesterday, and it's kind of really short-term thinking. What do I mean by this? Uh, the as soon as Russians have some setback somewhere, like it has happened in the past. For example, when Russians had some setbacks in Ukraine, the Armenian government's rhetoric about reorienting the country toward the West intensified. And now I'm also quite apprehensive that, given what happened in Syria and given the interpretation of it as a serious setback for Russia and demonstration of Russia's weakness and lack of capacity, now we have another window of opportunity, so we should intensify our efforts in the direction of reorienting the country, reorienting the country strategically toward the West. So I think it's very reactive, the Armenian government's position. What is not reactive, and what is a fundamental preference, I think it is pretty certain that the Pashinyan government and the Pashinyan team, even before they became a government, is in the category of political forces throughout Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union that are eager to take the country outside of Russia's strategic orbit and build closer ties to the West and be integrated into Western institutions. They see that as a path toward building a democratic society, toward building a well-governed country and economic and technological development, etc., etc. So this part or this aspiration seems to be constant in the Pashinyan team's approach. But what keeps shifting is, again, they react to events and they try to make adjustments, and now I think they are again going I feel that they are going to interpret the recent events as another window window of opportunity. Now, the reason I think it is a bad idea is not because I'm fundamentally opposed to close integration with the West. It's not because I'm fundamentally in disagreement about even about the higher chances of building certain institutions and having chances of certain kinds of economic development or technological development, etc., etc. Although one could make all kinds of arguments against these sort of views as well, but it's not a fundamental opposition to that informs my position. My position is informed by a very simple fact. The West's behavior in the post-communist world and in the post-Soviet countries is a threat and is seen as a threat to Russia. And Russia is reacting to that. And unless you can be assured of protection against that reaction, I think it's a very dangerous game to play. And we have had numerous other cases where this behavior has resulted in catastrophes for these countries. Ukraine is the most obvious example. Georgia is another example. And by the way, if we're speaking about this problem now and we're speaking about Georgia, look at what's happening in Georgia, right? I mean, in Georgia, they have gone through a certain process, and parts of the Georgian elite have come to the conclusion that the previous very radical policy of reorienting the country and breaking with Russia has not served Georgia's interests and has not really produced the results that they were promised or that they hoped it would produce. And by the way, this has serious implications for Armenia, not only in terms of, not only as an example from which we can draw conclusions, but imagine what happens when, well, I mean, not when, the Georgian Dream won the elections and now they're the government and now they are getting, building closer ties to Russia and they're in kind of a conflict with the West. What is going to be the implications of this picture for Armenia, where Armenia is the only country in the region that is still trying to fundamentally change its strategic orientation? Is it going to be easier to do with what's happening with what has happened in Georgia, or harder to do? I think that's another thing we have to think about.
Yeah. Speaking of Georgia, Zurabishvili is not acknowledging the results of the election. She's saying, what election, essentially. And the West seems to be supportive of the opposition in Georgia. And meanwhile, in a stunning decision in Romania, the Constitutional Court blamed TikTok and said that Russians interfered with the election, so it annulled the first round of the elections there. Do you think that this is essentially the momentary, let's say, brightness that you get from a supernova as a star dies, and by that star I mean the Biden administration's policies? And do you think that Trump will change things when he comes, or are we going to continue to see these types of tensions after Trump? And specifically, how is the Trump administration's policy going to affect these regional issues?
Well, I want to say two things in this regard. So first of all, I think this is a sign that what we have been dealing with fundamentally for quite some time now is not necessarily a clash between two ideologies, two different philosophies of governance, understanding of politics in general, but a simple old-fashioned geopolitical conflict where one side has been able to couch its geopolitical interests in certain rhetoric, in certain understanding of its preferences, its role internationally, its attitudes toward democracy, liberalism, human rights, and all these good things. But now that it has become more difficult to maintain that facade, everybody seems to have taken off their masks, and by everybody I mean the West. they don't pretend anymore. I mean, and it's not just Romania and Georgia. It is also, I mean, I think the heaviest blow dealt to the Western pretenses about their support for human rights and democracy was dealt by what has been happening in Gaza for the last year. But this also, I mean, in Georgia, I remember I watched an interview with Zurabishvili shortly after the elections, and the interviewer, and by the way, it was a Western interviewer, was asking her if you have any evidence of Russian interference or vote rigging or irregularities, massive irregularities that could have affected the outcome of the elections. Zurabishvili literally said, "I have no evidence, but I'm sure about that." I mean, this sort of thing has become normalized, and it's mind-boggling that people can say things like that. I mean, in Romania, they just canceled elections. They have threatened the president of Slovakia. I mean, he came out and said it, right? And he gave an interview, and they have threatened his life if he doesn't change his policy. And there was an assassination attempt against him. So this is amazing, and yet in some parts of the world, including in Armenia, you hear these very Manichaean discussions and these Manichaean descriptions of what the world is like, the dark, dictatorial, authoritarian, backward, reactionary Russia, and the West that stands for human rights and democracy and the rule of law and international law, and it has in fact become an uninteresting debate to have. So I got carried away a little bit. I don't remember if there was anything else in your question.
I mean, essentially, will Trump change things, or any predictions?
So there are two things that I don't share with people who are more optimistic about Trump's presidency. First of all, Trump himself is not a very consistent person. He's not a person with a consistent philosophy, with a consistent outlook on matters of politics, be it domestic or foreign. So he will make one statement in the morning and make another statement in the evening that contradicts the statement in the morning. He recently, I mean, I don't want to get again too carried away by this, but and this is not in the realm of international relations, but recently he gave a talk. He made a statement about reforming the educational system in the United States and how in recent years the universities have descended into this DEI nonsense, the diversity, equity, and inclusion nonsense, and have become this ideologic, propagandistic thing, and they are undermining academic freedom and the freedom of speech. And he's going to reform the educational institutions, and among many things, he's going to make sure that universities combat anti-Semitism. And it's like, you just undermined everything you said a minute ago, right? So looking for consistency and for a deep philosophical commitment to certain things in the case of Trump, I think is a fool's errand. But that's the least important thing about the prospects of what Trump will do. I think by now everybody knows, and this has become a more popular topic of conversation that it has been for quite some time. I think if you look at the power and the influence of the deep state, what they call the deep state, and it's kind of hard to define what is included in it, but certainly the national security bureaucracy and the defense industrial interests and certain lobbies that are very committed to maintaining the current status quo in American foreign policy. I think it is not a good idea to underestimate their power and their ability to impose certain things. Perhaps the only thing one can say about possible changes in US foreign policy, maybe they will have to make some trade-offs, because the assumption that has underpinned American behavior over the last 30 years or so has been that they are so powerful, they don't have to make trade-offs and choices, right? they can walk and chew gum at the same time. But it is becoming increasingly obvious that it is not the case anymore, and that serious costs can be imposed on them. That there has been adaptation by their adversaries in the way they deal with them, and they've had serious setbacks in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, elsewhere. And certainly, Ukraine looks like a disaster for the West. It's a disaster for everybody, but it's a disaster for the West. And they may make to cut some losses in some places, including in Ukraine. But this is not going to be because Trump has a different set of preferences. This may happen only if the deep state comes to that conclusion that this is becoming too costly and beyond the abilities of the United States to manage everything at the same time, and they have to make certain trade-offs. And given how the tensions are escalating with Iran and how serious the pressure is getting for taking care of the Iran problem, and particularly the fact that Iran is getting closer and closer to a de facto nuclear status, I think that is going to become probably the top priority for them. And that's one reason why I think that in other areas the United States policy may become a little more modest. Although again, I wouldn't bet on it, and even if it does, I think it's not for a good reason. I think the policy toward Iran and the likely, I would say, escalation of the conflict in Iran is a very, very serious problem. As I've said previously, I can't think of a more important issue for Armenia, a graver threat to Armenia than a United States and Israeli attack on Iran.
Arman, the Russian gains in Ukraine appear to be accelerating. Are you optimistic that the war in Ukraine may resolve in some format, negotiated solution, hopefully sometime soon in 2025, or do you think that this is going to continue on in 2025? And one more side question to that. When some kind of a resolution happens, what kind of a pivot do you think Russia will do on its other fronts, like the Middle East and the South Caucasus?
For answering the first part of the question, if you look at Trump's statements, it's clear that Trump understands that continuation of that war is not in America's interests. They're not achieving the goals that they thought they would achieve. But again, as I said already, much will depend on how the deep state reacts to how the deep state decides to deal with the problem, with the Russian advances, and with the very dire situation in Ukraine. Now, one problem that undermines my optimism that they might reach some compromise in Ukraine is that I have a hard time imagining a situation where the United States agrees to Russia's demands, which have become necessarily as a result of the war itself, have become much stiffer than what they were before the war, right? So neutrality guarantees for Ukraine, recognition of all the territorial gains for Russia. Any American president that signs under it is going to have serious political problems, and I have a difficult time imagining that this will be achieved easily. But if it were to be achieved, yeah, one thing in this regard I should point out, there is some talk of freezing the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So they also think in terms of, well, why don't we just freeze things and resume the conflict when we're strong enough, when we have the opportunity to regroup and refit.
But that is such a transparent effort to
Exactly.
stop an artificial point. But I do want to mention, Arman, that even though you're saying that the deep state may not want to be going in a direction or another. The problem is that if an American president signs under an agreement that gives Putin everything, they're going to have problems. On the flip side, it's also costing them a lot of allies. For example, in Canada, there's a lot of problems and they're shifting to the right. In Germany, that is the case. And we saw Macron's government fall apart. So there are a lot of problems with all these Western countries funding a war that they don't want to fund, their people don't really want to fund. And eventually, America might just find itself completely isolated and fighting its own proxy war.
Yes, I think that's true, and that's why I'm saying that it is possible, it is
Mhm.
conceivable that they might come to the conclusion that the war must end. Of course, I mean they can find a way of describing even the worst outcome as a victory, as a successful compromise, as getting something important. They probably will get some important things from Russia in negotiating a truce in Ukraine. But certainly the idea that they can freeze at the current lines and Russia will sort of tacitly agree with such a state of affairs. I don't think that's going to work because Russians understand full well that it is going to give Ukraine and the West the opportunity to regroup and resume hostilities later, right?
Mhm.
So I don't know. I think I'm really very moderately optimistic that they might come to some agreement in Ukraine again because some people in the national security establishment understand two things. They can't do everything at the same time, and Iran and possibly also China are more important than Ukraine. So if they come to that conclusion, I think it's possible that they will do it. I mean, one other thing that may get in the way of that is if you look at the American how American decisions are made, they're not usually made as a result of deep strategic thinking and weighing of costs and benefits and consequences. Sometimes the foreign policy decisions and even national security decisions are the consequence of bargains that various interest groups can negotiate, and usually sometimes the bargains are suboptimal in terms of achieving the necessary results that the foreign policy is designed to achieve. But yeah, and sometimes the most powerful lobbies can win, and the policy will reflect the interests of the powerful lobby rather than the United States um, or even the deep state collectively, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So these things are important to keep in mind. As to what where they will if the conflict in Ukraine is settled, will the Russians pivot to other things? Certainly, and there will be other things Russians will be able to focus on. And I think Caucasus seems to be an obvious place where they may be interested in consolidating or regaining their influence that they have lost, and it will certainly be an important development for the Caucasus if the conflict in Ukraine is settled. I think the strategic picture, the geopolitical picture, will be clarified in the Caucasus. And again, this is something I've said before on many occasions as well. One of the reasons why we Armenia and Azerbaijan have dragged their feet and haven't reached a compromise is precisely because of this geopolitical uncertainty, and precisely because they both have known in their different ways that they can do things without fearing a serious Russian intervention or a serious Russian pressure to come to terms that are in the best interests of Russia. Uh,
Okay.
and even if it were to take account the interests of the parties
Mhm.
in the conflict as well.
All right. So let's just leave it there for today. That was a lot of discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Grigoryan, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Asbed and Hovik. This was fun.
We will talk to you soon again, I hope.
I hope.
And if we don't talk before the holidays, happy holidays to you, and Merry Christmas, Happy New Year
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you and your families.
Շնորհավոր նոր տարի եւ Սուրբ Ծնունդ.
Bravo.
That's our show today. This episode was recorded on December 19, 2024. We've been talking with Dr. Arman Grigoryan, who is an associate professor of international relations at Lehigh University. He has a doctorate in political science from Columbia University in New York and a master's in international relations from the University of Chicago. His research has appeared in various international security and political science journals and reviews. For more on Dr. Grigoryan, check his bio through our show notes. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And I'm Hovik Manucharyan.
Please find us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are going to be in the show notes, and that's at podcasts.groong.org/episode number. We'll talk to you soon.